Next item, please.
Next item, we go back to special reports, board goals and assessment updates. Dr. Dan Patterson, Ms. Fatme Faraj, and Mr. Mike Asili.
Are you deciding who's going to speak?
You want to flip a coin?
We'll go ladies first.
Good evening again. Okay, so today's presentation is about the goals. If you recall, in February during the retreat, the board retreat, the board president and trustees each came up with one or more goals for the current school year, especially in light of the pandemic. In fact, each of those goals that were articulated by the board aligned with one or more areas under our strategic plan. So the purpose of tonight's board meeting presentation is to give a brief overview of the progress toward achieving these goals. Also combining with the board goals, we are presenting the laws and regulations from the United States Department of Ed and Michigan Department of Ed regarding the use of assessment for accountability purposes and how our district works to minimize time used by students and by teachers on assessing students as much as possible. With us, we have Dr. Patterson, Ms. Zaina Tiba, principal at Lindbergh, Ms. Kim Beckwith, she's a district special ed teacher, resource teacher and coach, Mr. Mike Asili, and I will be presenting on the goals briefly. As you can see, the alignment with the strategic plan, we labeled it with focus area 1, goal 1, so on and so forth. And if you recall, developing or establishing these plans, we put the names of the trustees and the president by each of the goals and how they align to our strategic plan. The only goal that we did not have on the strategic plan was the post-pandemic gains, but it does fall under the teaching and learning if you want to look at it closely. So the first goal was the learning loss, and for this specific goal, we know that we have great amount of learning loss by students as measured by MSTEP when students took it, NWEA, and we can see that by quantitative and qualitative data, we do have to push harder in terms of instruction, social emotional learning, to make sure that we close the gap that was created as a result of the pandemic. In third grade, the learning loss, or not necessarily the learning loss, the gap on MSTEP is greater than that of the state. Also in high school, it was, I don't think we had as large as a learning gap as we did in elementary, but we are alleviating this gap by implementing different strategies. You've heard about summer school, and also we have different practices that we implement during the school day. We call them embedded interventions, and this is called also tier 2. This is beyond what happens in the during the core instruction. So additional time and strategies are given to those students to make sure that they overcome the learning gap. We have the extended day that's going on now in schools, and we plan to have extended year again, which is summer school. Last year's summer school, we did use NWEA to measure the gains by our students, and we have found that students who attended summer school some of them attended the 8 weeks, some attended 5 weeks. We were flexible with time. They showed lower loss on spring to fall NWEA as we compared the data that was created by Dr. Patterson. College and career readiness goal that was established in February also, and it does fall under our strategic plan. This one is a twofold goal. One is the college and career readiness in terms of academic achievement, and the other is career paths. This is an ongoing goal in the current strategic plan. As I mentioned, every student has a plan for their future as part of the academies model that we have in Dearborn in the 3 high schools. Educational development plans are established with each of the middle school and high school students. One of the tools we use is called Zello in middle school and U-Science in high school. These are platforms used by the academies, the lead teachers, and also by the counselors. They are also systems that guide students to their ideal career. The assessment or surveys that they take will align their interests and strengths to which careers would best fit their goals in the future. Stakeholder engagement. This is actually focus area 3. It's a big area on the strategic plan that has 3 goals. Any strategies, any initiatives that we implement in the district, we involve all stakeholders. And our stakeholders groups are known to be student group, parents group, or families, and also staff. The staff is represented by administrators and teachers. What we do is maintain regular meetings between administrators and employees, bargaining groups, to improve job satisfaction and we use those results to drive improvement process. This type of data that we collect is called perception data or survey data. We constantly implement collaborative approach in decision-making. We have many examples of that. As we were establishing different routes on how to deal with a pandemic, for example, we never established one specific plan or strategy on our own from central office. We always involve teachers, administrators, non-instructional staff, and different departments. We have consulted also with MLI recently, which is the Michigan Leadership Institute that's also working with us on the bond on what else can we do to suggest some strategies on how to reach out further and implement a plan to involve teachers more and other staff members. We are currently seeking principals' input on what this might look like. As Adam, Jill, and I have been meeting with principals, we're asking them that specific question. What can we do to involve teachers and maybe form a group to hear teachers out? And this was discussed here in one of the meetings before. In terms of early childhood, we know this was one of the goals too. The slots in the GSRP continue to increase. If you notice on this graph, the increase in the number of students being served. From last year to this year, we have 96 additional slots. And again, that's dependent on Wayne County RISA and how many slots were given. Thanks to Dr. Chokol and Ms. Amy for reaching out all the time and for providing these slots to the families and recruiting students for this. We have a strong beginnings for the 3-year-old program. We have 14 students in that, and this is the second year this runs. Post-pandemic gains, we've invited Ms. Zaina Tiba and Ms. Kim Duckworth to share the post-pandemic gains.
Good evening. I'm Ms. Chiba, principal at Lindbergh Elementary, and with me is,
Kim Beckwith. I'm a resource teacher with the Special Education Department.
as well as coach. So we are here to talk a little bit about the perception surveys. Those surveys were administered to staff, students, and parents, and some of the things to highlight some of the post-pandemic gains. We often talk about losses and what we lost, but we wanted to focus a little bit on some of the gains that we felt, parents, students, and staff had done. And so we, in addition to that, during some of our JED admin meetings, we met with administrators, and we had some reflection activities on the same topic. And so some of the areas are summarized for you guys. Some of the things are, they felt there was an increased capacity among stakeholders in the areas of flexibility, adaptability, and resilience, and just in general, like being able to adapt to any given situation at any moment. You know, if this has taught us anything, it's that, you know, having plans in place and being able to adapt and be flexible is very important. The other one is increased attendance and voluntary meetings, having that ability through Zoom. Oftentimes your time is of importance and of essence, and so being able to do it through Zoom and things like that allows people an opportunity to attend those kinds of voluntary meetings.
We've also noticed an increase in individualized communications with families. This pandemic has helped humanize us on both ends, and helped to increase outreach that we might have with families, not just at a class or grade level, but to outreach to individual families. We've also seen a strengthening of our self-paced learning that we're doing in some of our schools, as well as more intentional collaborative planning between grade mates to make sure that students are leaving us with essential skills in place.
Some of the other things are teachers and students felt that there's increased use of digital tools and engagement tools. You know, a lot of what we did in teaching is in person, and so if this has taught us anything, it's how to use the digital tools and how to engage students in their learning.
As well as seeing all of our stakeholders improve in their digital literacy. So be that our teachers, our families, our students are all more familiar with the variety of digital communications and how to use them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know, as you all know, one of the goals was also social emotional learning, and I applaud the board for this wonderful goal. And I could tell you, you know, just before I kind of get into the details, you won't find many conversations now whenever you go into the building where social emotional learning isn't being talked about or discussed. And I think that in itself is a huge achievement. So we appreciate the staff for kind of thinking of the whole child and the student's needs. Now, as many of you know, I mean, I kind of broke it up into 3 different compartments. One of them is staffing. We currently have 47 school social workers employed in the district, which is a huge gain from where we were just a few years ago. We don't have one single building right now in the district that does not have at least one full-time social worker. So thank you to the board and to Dr. Maleko for supporting that. In addition, we have 3 behavioral specialists, and we're also looking at adding a trauma team, which will most likely consist of possibly social workers, OTs, psychologists, teachers. Those are some things that we continue to grow and work on for the social emotional aspect and the trauma aspect. We've also increased counselors over the last year with the 3 transitional counselors at the middle and the high school. What are some initiatives that we've had? Obviously, it all starts with committees, social emotional learning committees. We have one district committee. It's led by Dr. Swaidan and Dr. Rola Bazzi-Gates, and I regularly also am working very collaboratively with the 2. And they are extremely responsive and really understand the initiative and really have a lot of passion for it. I'll give you an example. Just this past Wednesday, just hours after the unfortunate situation in Oxford, we called a meeting not only with Dr. Swaidan and Dr. Bazzi-Gates, but all the high school social workers as well, to where they developed collectively within hours a crisis intervention plan that went out to mostly all staff in the district. They talked about just talking points, different types of interventions, so on and so forth, that they can possibly do with some of their students, just in case some of us did come up. Mental health matters. The social emotional hotline, you know, we're privileged here to have a couple of the school psychologists who worked very closely on that social emotional hotline when the pandemic first hit. And it was really generated with a lot of their thoughtfulness and their work, and it's evolved since then. And I know that some of you have possibly seen it. I know that it was going around some social media sites and whatnot just this past week, but we encourage everyone in the community, really in our schools, that, you know, if you need someone to talk to, a counselor, social worker, please reach out and call the hotline. We also had a mental health kickoff over the summer with Mr. Kevin Fisher, who I believe is part of the National Association of Mental Health Alliance. I may have got that completely wrong, but really came in and gave us his feedback and his input to a group of students. And I know some board members, Trustee Watts, also participated in as well as we really wanted to kick off really the summer and the school year with a lot of, social, emotional, mental health, so on and so forth. And one of, I think, the biggest accomplishments, especially for a district our size, is that we were able last year to train 70 staff members to be certified trauma presenters. And I'm happy to say that most of our staff members, all of our teachers have gone through the training, and actually it kicked off the school this year in August. And then it went through September and October on trauma-informed instruction. And I know that we were also highlighted with Wayne County RESA as well, just because of, our amazing staff that really stepped up, took the lead, and really believed in this initiative. So we're happy about that. What are some resources? Again, talking about that committee, we developed a social emotional webpage that could be accessed right off our district website. That includes not only social emotional resources for staff, but also parents, in addition to crisis and trauma resources. And I know that's very valuable, especially right now. We have a lot of families wondering, how do I address this with my child or whatnot? But there's some great resources there, and a lot of them are accredited. I know we use the National Association for School Psychologists as well. We do have different initiatives going on, positive behavior intervention supports, or PBIS. Within that model, I know 17 of our schools do participate in PBIS, but other schools are doing great things as well. I know we just partnered with the University of Michigan, who created a Trails program, which is a social emotional curriculum. We had about 10 schools who were interested in that. I know one of our high schools, Dearborn High, is already kind of hit the ground running with Trails and the social emotional curriculum that they have. We have other schools that are going to join them. In fact, there's a question and answer session on Wednesday for the few other schools who did sign up. Another thing is restorative practices. Now, we've been a restorative district for a while, and something with restorative practices is it builds that community and it builds that empathy. And if you really look at some of the SEL competencies from MDE, restorative practices fits in really, really nice. In addition to that, I know Dr. Violet Sweden, also at some of our high schools and middle schools, is also training students to be mediators with some of that as well, which I think will take us a long way, just having that school involvement and whatnot. So I guess that's pretty much it for the social emotional stuff. So I don't know.
All right, I'm going to finish by giving an overview of our current assessment program here at Dearborn. Last May, I presented on our assessments, and the board had asked for us to look for some further ways to reduce assessment time in our district. I put out a survey at the end of the year proposing some ways that we could do that, and we were able to implement many of those this year. Pretty much most what we have left are the required assessments by both federal and state. So I just want to review a few of those pieces of legislation that are around some of our testing programs. So the year before, or actually last year, with our extended continuation of learning plan, the state started to require benchmark assessments twice a year. That was something new that they hadn't required before. This year, they continued that requirement through Public Act 48. And according to the State Director of Assessment, this is something that will be continuing at least for the near future. So this new piece of legislation does require us to administer a benchmark assessment in grades K through 8 twice a year in reading and math. Once the first 9 weeks of school, and then the second time we can choose when that is within the school year. They asked that we try to continue whichever program we were using before. For us, that was NWEA, and that we also provide parents with results of those test scores. So there are some choices for us that the state provides. We are reimbursed for this fully, so we don't have to pay outright for this benchmark assessment. We've been using NWEA. There's iReady, another assessment called Renaissance Star, and then another version through the Smarter Balance Consortium. So these are all some options that we could use, but to be reimbursed by the state, we need to use one of the 4 approved vendors for the benchmark assessment. So that is a new state requirement, and we are by law required to give those assessments to receive our ESSER funding. So we also have federal and state assessment requirements. The federal government provides districts title funds, predominantly Title I funds for students in poverty and Title III funds for our bilingual students that are critical funds above and beyond what we get from our general fund, which is our pure pupil funding. The laws that govern these funds is the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act. This has been around since 1965, and it has been reauthorized every 5 or so years since that time. And the most recent reauthorization was, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, and that is now the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the way that this works is the federal government gives out requirements for states to assess students and have accountability based around some of these assessment scores. So each state has the ability to submit a plan, and so all 50 states' plans will look slightly different. The accountability and testing in Michigan looks different than it does in Indiana and Ohio, but we are all required to meet certain requirements, and the state is the one that oversees those requirements. So with ESSA, we're required to assess English learners. We use WIDA along with, I think, around 13 other states. And we also use MSTEP, PSAT, and SAT for the Title I requirement of those funds. So the two main pieces of legislation around testing are the title funds that we get from the federal government, and then also PA 48 for our benchmark assessments. So I put a table together of which assessments we have in our district and what level of requirement that they are from. And you can see that predominantly all of the assessments that are at least required at the district level are either federal or state required. We have a few additional reading by third assessments that aren't necessarily given to all of our students. Students that we think are struggling readers, we give some additional assessments to just because they give us good diagnostic information, and those are all assessments chosen by our early childhood reading specialist. And then our high schools also give screeners a few times a year because they found that information is very critical for tracking students' progress on essential standards and helping teachers kind of pick out the students that need some extra assistance. And then I also have a table showing the total time over the complete school year by grade of all of these assessments. Although looking at the yearly total, 15 hours, for example, in a few grades might look like a lot of assessment, when you spread that over 180 days, almost 1,100 instructional hours, the percent of time that students are spent actually taking these assessments, we've tried to keep fairly small. And I do know that especially in spring testing, we do have some special schedules. So like at the high schools, there's when the 11th graders take the SAT, we don't have the other grades coming in. But for the most part, we really do try to minimize the amount of time students are outside of classrooms taking these assessments. And at this point, there's very little on top of this that we can really remove at these points because these are, as I mentioned, federally or state required. And then I'd also just like to mention a few of the places that we use these assessment results. All of our schools are required to create educational plans centered around goals and areas that they'd like to work on and improve. The state has an acronym for that. It used to be our SIP program, our school improvement process. Now it's called the Michigan Integrated Continuous Improvement Process, or MICIP. But these are mandated plans that we have to submit to the state through a platform. And we do use our assessment as one piece of data among many other pieces of data that's required as part of this planning. We also use our assessment data for a lot of internal research. For example, we just submitted a board brief showing that our students that attended summer school did show better academic outcomes than those students that didn't. If we didn't have some assessments that all of our students took, a couple times a year, it would be hard to track some of those educational programs we have and which ones were being beneficial and which ones we might need to take a look at. We are also required to do public reporting to our stakeholders. We use these results in our strategic planning. And then as Mr. Asali has mentioned, we have a big focus on our social emotional learning right now. We've been doing surveys with our staff and parents and students, and we plan on continuing to do that as well in the future. So I think that is the end of our presentation. So any questions or comments?
Trustee McDonald.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your efforts to minimize the amount of testing that we do. And I'm just curious, I didn't see anything in your data. On average, can you say how much you were able to minimize that per grade, or
When I
or maybe
first
the worst case or the best case scenario?
When I first came to the district, we did an inventory with our assessments, and I think we were closer to around the 4% range. And that was on par with what I've seen from some research on what other like urban large districts do. And so we really have tried over the years to reduce it as much as possible. So we are well below other large district averages across the nation,
You
I would
made
say
good
at this
strides.
point.
Thank you for your efforts.
Trustee Watts.
Oh, I didn't realize it was me next, okay. I wanted to say thank you, especially for the social emotional component, because I don't think we realized that we would be here today speaking so much about the SEL. So a couple of questions. The social emotional hotline, is somebody manning it, or is it a recording? What, if I call
No,
it, what happens?
So it'll go straight to a voicemail, and that voicemail will go straight to one of our lead social workers in the district, who will vet it to whoever it needs to go to. Typically, we try to send it to either the counselor or the social worker of the specific building, assuming that they may know the student or may already have a relationship with
Do we
them.
know what the response time is?
Honestly, typically it is within hours sometimes, even, I could tell you that, it hasn't been too busy lately, the line, but I could tell you when the pandemic first happened and we were getting calls on the weekend, I mean, we had even counselors and social workers being responsive right there and then, whether it was a weekend or whatever the situation may be. So it's very, very fast.
Okay, and then do we know, when you were speaking about that, how many people access and utilize that line?
Yeah,
on
I could
average?
tell you this year, not many, maybe now considering that we kind of, again, are in a crisis mode almost again, hopefully that'll pick up some traction. I could tell you when the pandemic first started, we had a few people who were accessing the line, especially when we first were kind of in quarantine and in isolation, so on and so forth.
Now, would it be possible for that line to turn it into a text? Like, for instance, if somebody, so that it could be more responsive, so if somebody were to call, like, if they were to have the courage to call the phone number, that they could, instead of a voice, they could
Actually,
respond back and
there's
forth?
an email attached to it as well. So it's
Okay.
not only a line, there's also an email attached to it as well. So if they're not comfortable calling and leaving a message, they can always email their concerns. And actually, that's where the whole weekend thing, that's what I was kind of referring to, was actually an email that was sent to the specific line, then routed to the appropriate person.
I'm just thinking if somebody were to text, then they would be
Oh,
able to get a
yeah,
response, but I'm not
definitely.
quite sure.
I
how that would
could
be
try to work
staffed.
with our great technology director, Mr. Bob Addy, to see how we can
That would-
figure out a way how to have it
Again, just looking at ways to improve,
accessible
right?
for
We're always
text
looking for
messaging.
that.
Sure.
And then the other thing is that, and this may be for Bob Addy, but I was looking on the Dearborn website, the Dearborn public website, and I think, is it possible, and I'm not sure, if we can temporarily put our social and emotional link as maybe on the homepage, especially during this crisis, that the student, with what, the uncertainty that's happening, just so that instead of them having to find it under a tab, if that's something that we can temporarily do just to help with students and parents, so they know where those resources are.
We can have David and Bob and Chris look at that, see where it can go.
Perfect. I was just thinking that it's one less there, it's there for them.
Sure.
So thank you for that.
Oh.
I think that was it for the social and emotional
All
portion.
right, thank you.
And then I do have a question for Dr. Patterson, because I love standardized testing so much in assessments. But so thank you for reducing that, because I think that'll help alleviate some of the additional stresses. So then going back to the presentation, there was a list of there's 4 approved tests.
Yes.
And I'm unfamiliar other than the NWEA.
Yeah, so we are actually currently looking at two of the other assessments as well. Just like all of our curricular choices, every so many years, we should take a look at what's out there just to see if we have something that might be better suited for us. So we're currently looking at both iReady and the Renaissance Star to see if they might offer anything better for our district. So we're going to be looking at those during the winter time. And if we do make a recommendation to look at something different in the future, that will come to the board before the end of this academic school year.
Perfect, that's exactly what I was gonna ask, if there was one that was better than the others in terms of what was out there. And then there was a table that, with the data about the percentage of time for the assessments
Yes.
in terms of the classroom time, but do we have a percentage then of time that is spent for test prep?
That is not in there. The test prep, there are a few different types of test prep. We do not encourage the test prep in terms of trying to like gain test scores. Trying to like drill, these are the types of questions you're gonna see, and kind of that rote working on those skills. For M-STEP, for example, there is a short, like 3 or 4 question assessment just so students can see this is how you log in, this is what the interface looks like, this is how you click. If you want to highlight text, this is what you do. Those generally take 15 minutes to kind of go through that type of test prep. I know some teachers might do some other things on top of that. That's information we haven't gathered. But really the only type of test prep we try to encourage is just what we call non-substantive test prep, which is really just getting kids to understand this is what type of test you're going to be taking, just so they don't have, when they see it for the first time, they don't have that other cognitive work that they're doing to understand how do I answer this, so they can just focus on the question that's in front of them. So for most of the assessments listed on here, that should be fairly insubstantial on top of this. But in terms of the other test prep, that's nothing that we've really as a district ever endorsed. There's always things kind of embedded throughout the curriculum in terms of this might be something that might look like SAT as like a bell work or something like that. But we don't want our teachers to set aside days or hours to just focus on those things.
So we don't have any necessarily pre-COVID data to show what sort of time was spent?
No,
test
we
prep?
don't collect that. That's something we would have to survey our teachers on to see what they typically do in terms of time for
And
that.
Trustee Watts, this was something that, Dr. Patterson, it doesn't feel like too long ago you were addressing these items. It might have been when you were virtual for the meeting. But it was not too long ago, because I remember you saying that there's not really a lot of time spent preparing for the test in terms of, like you said, rote memory.
Well, I think if we could get then maybe a survey from the teachers just to see like with the reduction in the tests required that we, from a percentage of what we reduced, to see if they've been able to then reduce how much time they spent, since we reduced some of the NWEA requirements, I think, in the winter time. Just something
I
for.
mean, the direction from us has been, we don't want test prep, so, I mean, that's just one of the things, so it'd be hard to, we could still like find out from the principals, but our direction has been pretty clear and consistent. So if someone's doing it, they're kind of doing it on their own, but not any district initiated program. So I think if we do it, we'd have to be careful with how we word it in the survey, but just so you know, I mean, it'll be clear here publicly, that's our direction, and we've been consistent with that, so.
Can I add to that? In the past, we didn't have common resources in classrooms. And
Okay, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
we didn't have common resources.
Okay.
That reflected grade level essentials. And typically, M-STEP and SAT and the state assessments, they assess against a grade level, which many students were not ready for that, and maybe some teachers were not using grade level resources. Since we adopted grade level resources that were vetted and do reflect grade level essentials, what I noticed and what many of us noticed, that teachers don't see the need for test prep anymore. Students are exposed to grade level resources and essentials, therefore they perform better on state assessments, and there's no need for the test prep as much as it was practiced in the past. If that makes
Trustee
sense.
Moses, sorry.
Yeah, I think my question has been asked, but Dr. Patterson, if you can with that table that you said, this has been kind of condensed, and we truly appreciate that. If we can just get a comparison from the year before and the year, so we would know the difference.
Yes, I can definitely get that
And
to you.
then, one more question, aren't we using iReady for some assessments already, though?
We have a few schools that have elected to use it as an additional resource, and that's one of the reasons we're looking at it as a possible district-wide resource. Our middle school math teachers have been using it because the company that creates iReady also has created our middle school math program, so those two resources work very well together. And we also have a few elementary schools that have found it to be a useful program as well. iReady actually has two pieces to it. They have a diagnostic assessment similar to NWE that's computer adaptive, but then there's an additional instructional piece to it that once the student takes an assess, it'll look for strengths and weaknesses and put them on kind of a learning path. The Star Renaissance program has something similar. NWEA doesn't produce any curriculum. There are some third-party companies that have similar resources that a few of our elementary schools use as well, like Edmentum is one that a few of them use. So you are right, a few of our schools do use iReady,
Yeah,
and that is
I
why
remember
we're,
receiving an iReport.
yes.
Report from my son. So if a student takes the iReady, do they still take the NWEA for the same subject?
Yes, they have been, and
Okay,
that's
so
one
this
of the
is an
reasons why
addition
we're
for some schools,
looking at that
okay.
in the future to again try to make that a much more streamlined process.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you getting up here and talking about these items that we'd asked for.
Thank you.